Ever felt the sharp jab of betrayal? "It's not what you think," her voice echoed, a lie unraveling. As a devoted husband and a diligent nurse, I wove dreams around my family, safeguarding our future with hard-earned inheritance. Yet, our home, once a sanctuary, now whispered secrets. The moment of revelation came unexpectedly, as an anonymous email, a digital missive bearing the weight of betrayal, landed in my inbox. Attached was a video, irrefutable evidence of my wife's infidelity, a visual testament to the crumbling of our shared dreams. This is my story, a testament to endurance. Enjoy watching. In any emergency, there are some things to do first. When someone goes into cardiac arrest, you pump their chest to oxygenate their brain until someone can assist in defibrillating their heart and ideally restoring normal rhythm. You staunch the bleeding before you think about a shattered bone. I sat on the patio trying to figure out what I should do first. I had no idea. It was a first for me. I was extremely surprised. As a licensed critical care nurse, I gained a keen sense of observation. I could detect minor indicators that a patient was in peril long before they started slipping down the tubes. Then, I would take the right action. This talent saved lives, but I never spotted the warning indications that my nearly 8-year marriage was doomed. At this time, the only decision I had made was that I was not going to try to renew it. On the contrary, I meant to rip the plug from the socket and make the end as agonizing as possible. After some thinking, I revised my decision. I wanted it to be painful for my soon-to-be ex-wife. However, there were innocent persons engaged. I didn't want to hurt them when I went after the cheating bitch and her lover. I took another sip of my beer and gazed around the backyard, considering my options, with the exception of a couple of oak trees and 3 pecan trees. I had grown a level grass lawn that extended from my patio to the bayou. We've already experienced enough snake troubles in Louisiana. There was no reason to build more habitat near the house. My only concession to bushes were the azaleas in the front yard. The house behind me was spacious, with 4 bedrooms and 3 bathrooms. It included a conventional Southern-style covered porch. Aside than that, there was nothing typical about it. Inside, it had all of the latest modern comforts. The plumbing and electrical systems were of the highest quality when it was built. There were no shortcuts cut during building. The modern kitchen had never been remodeled, but appliances had been changed over the years. The roof was covered in solar panels. I couldn't afford this house and the 8 acres of land surrounding it on a nurse's wage. It was a present from my father and grandfather. When I announced my engagement to Bonnie, the land had been in my family for several generations. My grandfather and father built the house themselves, or rather through the building company they owned. Thornton's boys were well known in our community and were now managed by one of my relatives. My father and his brother had retired by now. Pope died 2 years ago. He was upset when I refused to join the family firm, but he respected my decision to return to nursing school after earning a degree in business administration and working in an office for several years. After laboring in the heat and humidity throughout my high school and college holidays, I had no desire to pursue a career in construction. I've never been interested in making money for its own sake. I only had enough to support my family. Of course, that meant being able to acquire some rather opulent toys. I had a beautiful boat that we utilized for fishing and camping trips, as well as a pickup truck to transport it over land. I purchased any fishing gear I wanted. I had rifles and shotguns, as do all normal Cajuns. When I could, I took vacations with my family and worked as an assistant head nurse in the intensive care unit at our local hospital. I always gave my children equipment for their own activities outside of patient care. My family was the most important thing in my life, and suddenly their happiness was in peril. I looked around the 200 yards that separated me from the neighboring house and noticed a woman walking out of the back door. Except for the furniture and color style, her house was an exact reproduction of mine, even down to the same plot of ground. My grandfather had built my sister's house shortly after finishing mine. We shared a dock and boathouse in the bay. I lifted my hand to draw her attention, and she moved in my direction. We needed to have a serious conversation. "Rob, aren't you a little early to start today?" "It's only 2 o'clock, she inquired, pointing to the drink in my hand. "An entire cooler?" she inquired, glancing at Coleman next to the lawn chair I was sitting in. I have the rest of the week off, and I am in the mood, I replied quietly. She knew I worked 12-hour shifts and took at least 3 days off each week. Sometimes I took one day off after another to go on a quick trip without utilizing vacation time. I enjoyed working overtime. It allowed me to pay for some extras. I didn't want to waste my time going back and forth to fetch a beer. I reached inside my fridge and handed her a single mug. She opened the lid and sat down. So, what was so vital that we needed to talk about right now? I almost peed myself. When you urged me to take the day off work and come home, especially since you mentioned I shouldn't call anyone before speaking with you. I told Susan that if you hadn't told me there were no injuries or deaths and it wasn't an emergency, I would have freaked out. But you don't seem bothered. I know you didn't just call me home because you needed a drinking partner. Let's cut to the chase. I said, Bonnie was cheating on me, and I discovered this just a few hours ago. I received an email. I tried to phrase it as if I were talking about the weather, but my voice shook. Are you certain? I mean, that would be a nasty prank, but are you certain someone isn't simply playing with you? She asked incredulously. I nodded and stated there was a video file attached to the message, and it was clear who sent it. I said, I don't know. It basically said, you should be aware that your wife is cheating. Here is the proof. I will send it later. The man's name was outraged. 999. I have never heard of them. Susan thought over my statements for a second or two before launching into a diatribe. She is a cheater, she shouted. How could she? Doesn't she know you'll damage both her and the person she's having pleasure with? Why? I will pull her down onto her bald head. Do not meddle with us, coons. So who is this guy in the video? I nodded and started my mouth to respond, but she interrupted me. If Rich ever cheated on me, I would simply destroy him. Speaking of which, how does Bonnie find the time to have an affair? She is home virtually every night, except for the bachelorette parties we held with her pals, and I'm always present. She does not even pretend to glance at other males. Furthermore, she works alongside Rich, and they are usually motivated to collaborate. He would see she was having fun. Susan paused, and I knew she had noticed my astonished expression. My sister was always a fast thinker. No way, she exclaimed. She is cheating on my spouse. They're cheating on us with one another. Her face changed from red to scarlet. Tears filled her eyes. I'm so sorry. I had hoped to tell you this gently, I murmured, leaning down and taking her into my arms. I've had a few hours to think about it and relax, at least enough to keep from pulling out a gun and going berserk. She cried briefly, then stiffened. Her crafty-ass heritage was coming to light. She never doubted that I had spoken the truth. So what do? Wait for them to get home, then kick their asses? Asked Susan. I adore the bastard, but I'm not going to put up with his nonsense. No, we're going to become smarter. I stated that we do not give the appearance of guessing. We're acting the same manner tonight that we did yesterday. We shall give our spouses a kiss. Susan frowned. I am serious. You have to act normally. We need to devise a plan. We will seek legal guidance tomorrow. The good news is that we know we have not contracted any STDs, unless you are kidding. 2, I added with a smirk to ease the irritation. Susan pointed her finger at me. Hell no, I didn't think about it. Well, not really. You recognize me? I might make jokes about being a TV celebrity or anything, but I'm never going to star in a movie. She finished the last of her beer and threw the can in the trash beside the other pacifiers. I handed her a full one as she extended her hand, and simply 4. I won't do this with Rich either. I just got my period 5 minutes ago, she chuckled. This will endure until we put the hammer down on those cheating assholes. He is not going to get anything from me. Bonnie can assist him if she wants to. She'll be pleased to have his cheating ass. And we must not tell the youngsters about this, I warned. At least, not yet. Susan wanted to know where they were. I attempted to send them all to see Mom and Dad this morning, but they did not depart until a short time ago. They finally left when I arrived here. Daddy has some projects he wants the lads to help with, while the girls can do anything they wish. They took their time departing. They did not debate or pose any queries. They quickly got into Jason's car and drove away. Goodbye, kids. We met my 2 kids. And her 3. They spent the entire summer together because the COVID-19 outbreak had limited our ability to engage in typical activities. They weren't separated until they were at school, but even then, They looked out for one another. My 17-year-old son, Jason, was the oldest. Rob, named after me, was the oldest, followed by Susan, who was just a few months younger than Jason. Her twins, Dave, Guy, and Cindy, girl, were a year younger. They were all 16, as was my daughter Deirdre. Having 5 children in under 2 years was both overwhelming and rewarding. 5 newborns, followed by toddlers. It was difficult in the early years. Following that, the baby factories shuttered. However, as the youngsters grew older, they resembled siblings rather than cousins. Rich has always been an excellent father and uncle. He showed an interest in the children's education and assisted them with their academics. Despite the fact that I helped them with their studies, I was in charge of most of the fun outdoor activities. I'd never played sports, so I treated the kids the way I was reared. I taught them the skills I learned while growing up. I went them camping, fishing, and hunting. When the kids were young, we would go camping in the backyard, away from the house but not on the bayou. Of course, the girls insisted on having an equal opportunity to participate, so I'd take the males first, followed by the girls about a week later. It was a wonderful bonding experience as the children grew older. On these outings, we ventured further into the marsh. It was getting congested with all the kids fishing, so I'd get Rich or Susan to drive the other boat. This permitted Rich to venture out into the woods, as he described it. But for the past year or two, he has let his sons run his yacht while he stayed at home. As they grew older, we stopped taking only tiny amounts of food on outings. It usually included sauces and spices, a bag of dried beans, and some rice. If the kids wanted to eat, they had to go acquire their own food. Anything captured was shared. However, if the booty was not plentiful, we might not have a good meal that night. The children happily accepted the challenge, just as I had planned. I called them my kids. Everyone was tough as hell, self-sufficient, and understood the importance of family and collaboration. They learned to work as a team. Just 3 weeks ago, I changed my work schedule so that I could take 6 straight days off. I drove one boat with the girls as passengers while the boys loaded into another. We moved slowly to avoid snags and shallow water. I stopped the boat several times to allow both females to take turns driving. The boys were also switching positions. We spent a week at the old Buddy Poe fish camp, fishing and even going downstream to get crabs in the saline water. We used cast nets to get bait or turned over half-decayed logs to find crickets and frogs. We bonded completely as a family. Bonnie and Rich didn't seem to care much about family togetherness. My heart was breaking at the notion of informing the kids about Bonnie and Rich's romance. The family meant everything. To sever that oneness from inside would be unforgivable. That is what I told Susan. We can't hide it from them, she explained. However, we can postpone it a little. I'll be careful not to tell them anything's wrong, she promised. So what will we do next? I cannot forgive or forget infidelity. I simply can't. I said that it didn't matter what Bonnie promised or how she made excuses. Susan nodded. I can put up with a lot of things except adultery. I am going to get rid of her. I just need to figure out how to accomplish it without losing anything. As much as I want to convert her into alligator shit, I'm not willing to risk going to jail. I also cannot let her take the kids. Similarly, I cannot stop Rich in his tracks or break his legs. I need to be there for the kids. I finished my drink and opened the refrigerator for another. Okay. Set aside my sincere desire to see the Riches remain, not throw them on a fishing hook as he watches and screams. I see your reasoning, Susan said. The next step is to break him financially. I'll take every penny I can get. I'm going to make him pay child support, alimony, and whatever else I can. I agreed and told her she could do it because Rich earned more money than she did. But Bonnie could take me to the penthouse. Because the courts favored women in divorce proceedings, I learnt from people I knew. Look, in my job I primarily deal with trusts and wills, but as a paralegal, I know enough about the procedure to know that we have greater protection than you realize. Remember that our most valuable assets are safe. Susan smirked, her eyes nasty. They have no access to our homes. Daddy gave them to us before we got married, and he made sure they were in our names. Only Bonnie and Rich can't claim them. I'm not sure Bonnie can persuade a judge to let her stay in your home until both of your children have left, but I do know she has no claim to the property itself. She cannot even claim the improvements you've made, such as the solar system. That's dubious. Boats, automobiles, and trucks. She can acquire half of those, but not a house. Did you and Bonnie sign a prenuptial agreement when you married? I asked Susan. Dad demanded that I do it. I thought it was all nonsense at the time, but he said you signed one and he copied it. I had completely forgotten about that prenup. Bonnie's father was a highly paid plastic surgeon. He wasn't pleased when I got his only daughter pregnant. She returned home for summer break during her first year of college, having recently graduated from high school. In his mind, I was a wild card. That opinion held some validity until I met Bonnie. I never touched a lady again. His attorney drafted a prenuptial agreement that stated that if either party was found guilty of adultery, they would leave the marriage with only 20% of the accrued joint assets. In Louisiana, the guilty adulterer would not receive alimony or maintenance. If both couples sign a prenuptial agreement before marriage, it can help them avoid community property restrictions. My father-in-law made we sign one. He was convinced that sooner or later I would screw over his little daughter and steal half of the riches he intended to leave her. The sole exemption was for 401k accounts. My own father was aware of this agreement and requested that Susan and Richard sign a similar contract when they married, a few months later. My father-in-law took years to learn that his daughter was not in danger as a result of my infidelity. I eventually changed his mind. He was aware that I was respected by the other doctors in the hospital system. He even advised I attend medical school and offered to pay for my fees. I, of course, declined. I was content where I was. Too many doctors I know appeared to be workaholics. They made good money, but most of them worked insanely long hours. Family time at home was quite essential to me. Susan surprisingly said, "I'm worried about that video of Rich and Bonnie having fun." Holy crap, I thought. I mean, who recorded it? How they recorded it for themselves. And it was discovered online. There are many questions. As best as I could tell, there were at least 3 cameras present. I said the video I received was not modified. It depicted the same occurrence from different perspectives, implying that whoever was shooting had not yet edited the raw material. I watched it multiple times. One thing that stood out to me was that neither Rick nor Bonnie looked at the camera or said anything to indicate that they were aware of its presence. There was not even a slip of the tongue. I don't think they were even aware they were being videotaped, I said. Susan requested that I get out my tablet and show her the entire video. "Holy shit!" she exclaimed. Susan was enraged by Rich and Bonnie's occasional comments on the tape about how Susan and I had no knowledge of their love affair. Rich is finished, but I still have a problem with the person who created the terrible video. We need to find out. I don't want it to bite us in the rear in the future. I don't care if the entire world sees it, so long as it does not reflect on us. I agreed and suggested that we wait off on a public reaction. Susan sat quietly for a few minutes. It appeared to me that she was considering what we should do next. Then I heard her sob. The sobs suddenly evolved into sobs. I leaned out to hug her. I couldn't hold back my own tears. Neither of us could keep our anguish hidden any longer. I wasn't actually intoxicated that night, but I'd gotten a little carried away. When I met Bonnie at the door, I had a half-full beer in one hand and greeted her with a hug and kiss. I half expected her to pull away and head for the shower. Instead, she grabbed me and forcibly kissed me. I sniffed her hair and neck for any hint of aftershave scent. Nothing but her own delicate perfume. I had just completed 4 days of a 12-hour shift, but I instantly remembered what I had learnt that day. I was so enraged that I couldn't stop myself from doing anything dreadful. I took a sip of beer and informed her that dinner was ready. She looked at me as if I was insane when I immediately stopped playing and said, "Let's eat." As I went away, I heard her mumble softly, "Damn, I was hoping you'd eat something, but there was no food." Susan and I had already decided to get takeout today. Neither of us was in the mood to cook. We joked that if we cooked, we could poison our spouses without endangering the children. The fun we had together did not provide much relief. It was only a safety valve that prevented us from bursting. The next day, I watched Bonnie load her roguish ass into Rich's car and drive to work. I called Susan. "How did it go?" I asked. "No problem," she said. "I would have freaked out several times if we hadn't joked and discussed how we were going to approach yesterday. He's probably going to hang out with Bonnie tonight. Do you have an idea where they're going?" I could see she was upset and needed to vent. Susan had always been a bit of a loose cannon, but she was still raw and wanted to vent. We needed to be open about our sentiments for a while. If the conversation was harder than usual between brother and sister, we would go through with it. That is okay to me as well. Susan and I arrived at her boss's office at 10 a.m. Susan handled the majority of the trusts and wills through the same firm, which was fine. Jake had attended school with us. He was a sensible divorce attorney who agreed to represent us. He was a true friend. Okay. Are you certain you have a recording that clearly shows both parties, specifically your spouses? I asked Jake. We assured him that we had conclusive evidence, but we chose not to show it to him. Not yet, at least. He shrugged. As long as you have hard evidence of infidelity, that's fine. I've reviewed your prenuptial agreements. They are strict. Rob, I can't believe you signed anything like that. You should have asked a lawyer about this, didn't you? I told him that I did. My father insisted on seeking a legal opinion. Then he used the same document when Susan married Rich. Wow. If one of you starts messing around, things can go extremely bad. It boils down to the person who cheats receiving only 20% of total shared assets. This comprises savings, bank accounts, stocks, and so on. The key point here is that there are no provisions for personal income accounts. Do any of you have an income annuity, royalties, or anything else that no one knows about? Susan and I shook our heads. What kind of account are we talking about? I asked. Okay, said Jake. Suppose Bonnie has an account she started on her own before you married. Perhaps the money she received at your wedding. You understand. You know, if they legitimately imposed bills on her, she could even claim it was her money, plus whatever interest she may have earned. Even if she invested that money in a business, the entire account would belong to her. I nodded. It's not an issue, I responded. What if she received money after the wedding but did not inform me about it? I asked. Common property, such as if you purchased a car or a new boat but did not inform her, as well as some of the difficulty places or house upgrades you've done. You own the homes on your title. They are protected since they were given to you before marriage. Upgrading refrigerators or furnaces incurs replacement costs, just as repairing or repainting walls does. But you both installed solar panels. A judge may or may not rule that they are part of the common property since they represent a major improvement on which common property funds have been spent. So she only gets 20% because she's a cheating bitch, right? I asked. I am willing to let her have that. Hell, she can make the same claim because of all the furnishings we purchased. We can also negotiate that in our benefit. You can even insist on her taking 1/5 of the property and moving it off the grounds. She will have to pay for its transit and storage. Jake grinned. That could be a pain in the ass, causing more harm than good. She might decide to give it to you. Its tiny games will be played as we move along. The main thing is that you both have solid prenups, as long as you have proof of adultery. But I warn you, make sure the video copies you have are well hidden and confidential. Do not distribute it to the public. They can and will most likely sue you if it appears on the internet. If they can establish that you filmed and posted it, or if they filmed it and it accidentally became public, that is their problem. It all relies on how the footage was acquired. It's better to be cautious. Jake watched us closely to ensure we got his message. Both Susan and I nodded. We had previously discussed editing the film and distributing it to every one of our friends and relatives. The only thing holding us back thus far was the backlash against our children. We were even more keen to find out who was filming what was going on. The next question was when we could acquire the divorce paperwork from our in-laws. We decided on Thursday at 12 o'clock. I proposed waiting until Friday afternoon. Then they'd have to spend the entire weekend contemplating their situation, wondering what Susan and I knew. Furthermore, they would require extra time to seek legal advice. Jake changed my mind, claiming that the longer we dragged this matter on, the more it would cost. He stated that he would need financial statements from each of them detailing their personal assets. That will keep them busy all weekend. Furthermore, even if their attorney speaks with them over the weekend, their legal bills will almost certainly rise. It will raise them higher than usual, he stated. Susan and I initially desired that they be served in a manner that allowed us to observe. We even spoke about taking them out to lunch on Thursday so we could attend. Jake laughed and remarked that, while it might be enjoyable, it was not a good idea. Finally, We decided to serve them at work in front of the entire team. We waved goodbye to a beaming Jake and headed to the bank, where we planned to spend the next few hours transferring money. We noticed fresh checking and savings accounts under our names solely. We obtained statements for all accounts and subsequently moved 80% to our new accounts. Unfortunately, our spouses' cars have been paid off. We imagined their automobiles getting repossessed and having to walk to work. Both families were so conservative that we had almost no debt save for recent credit card expenditures. We paid off and canceled the credit cards, then opened new accounts in our names. However, the replacement cards took a day or two to arrive. Jake urged us not to conceal our activity and to keep paper documents. I checked my email. I had 3 more attachments in which Bonnie and Rich were doing it. The room remained the same as before. I appreciate your help. I responded to my unknown benefactor by email, but I'd like to know how you obtained those films. I'm also concerned about them getting into the internet. I hope that does not happen. I wish that each of these movies could be edited and presented to the public, making Bonnie and Rich celebrities. But after speaking with Jake, I decided to be careful. We wanted to ensure that Rich and Bonnie could not link Susan and me to the publishing and pursue a legal claim. In my defense, I could access my own email account. An hour later, I received a response. The address was simple: 203 Victoria Street, apartment 201. I went there to find the apartment building. As I expected, the woman behind the counter would not tell me who had rented the unit, at least not right now. Look, I think my brother-in-law rented this place for an illicit affair, I began. I got a blank stare in response. I need to know if he is a tenant. Same blank stare. I decided to switch strategies. Okay, I notice you don't want to tell me if it's his flat or not. But here's the deal. He has a history of drug dealing and involvement in a white slave-selling organization. You know, whores. I spoke coarsely, but what can I say? I did it off the top of my head. What do your other tenants think about the cops? The FBI, DEA, and even ICE swooped in and blocked off the entire building. Perform an apartment search. Would that be beneficial for business? Would your tenants be pleased? That caught her interest. What do you truly want? She asked with a frown. I grinned back. Who is renting this apartment? And for how long? I said. The printout was in my pocket, and 5 minutes later, I was in my car heading away. Rich and Bonnie's insurance firm had rented the apartment for the past 2 years. As an authorized person, his name and signature appeared on the contract. I had no idea who discovered it, but Rich's tiny love nest had been revealed. I was wondering how the corporation would respond if they discovered they were paying for Rich's affair. I mentally noted that I'd find out someday. Bonnie's reaction to being served was quick and aggressive. She called me at 12:30. I was curious what had happened in the 30 minutes between receiving the warning and her call. What the hell do you mean? Do you desire a divorce? She demanded. I nearly choked when I informed her I knew she'd found someone else, so I was about to set her free. I didn't reveal that I had videotapes that proved she was a cheating bitch. Susan and I practiced our answers. I hope so. My sister remained cool while interacting with Rich. What exactly are you talking about, asshole? Adultery? Bonnie growled. I know some folks here question why Rich and I are so close. I've heard the insane rumor myself. They've been going around for a while. He's my brother-in-law, for goodness sake. Are you really such an idiot that you believed some secretary or anything that Rich and I were having an affair? Yeah, I suppose so, I said softly. Well, if you're that stupid, let me tell you what happens if you insist on it, Bonnie stated. If you want to get divorced, go ahead. You can move out. I'll get custody of the kids and you'll pay child support. Big money. I'll get half of all our belongings, including your treasured boat and truck. I'll make sure you have to sell them to pay me back. Not to mention the rest of your camping and fishing supplies. I will reside in the house and you will cover the expenses. I will chase every dime of child support I can obtain. I don't currently have a boyfriend, but I'm sure I will. I know Sue also served Rich. Hell, he could live with me, and you may pay for it. You can move in with your sister and wonder what Rich and I are doing at my house. Is this what you want? Go ahead, I said. Find yourself a lawyer. I couldn't stop myself from breaking down in tears over my marriage's implosion and the bitch's insistence on my innocence. I was prepared to erupt, not to mention her quick counterattack. I prayed Susan hadn't divulged too much or gotten too affluent. By the way, the girls are packing your belongings. Susan has told the boys to pack Richard's belongings. Everything will be put in front of the home, and you can pick it up this afternoon. We received a restraining order and changed the locks this morning. You two will have to find another home to stay while the court decides who gets what. Bonnie started yelling, so I hung up the phone. Susan texted me back around 10 minutes later. Yard, bring your fridge. Ensure that it is complete. Rich is such a jerk. She started sipping her beer. He began with, Hey, darling, you won't believe what some secretaries might think, simply because Bonnie and I are close. I informed her Bonnie had also implicated an anonymous secretary. I described Bonnie's reaction. The imbecile basically denied that they touched each other at all. He informed me, we can't believe any of it. I swear that if he were here right now, I would hit him. He'd look like a pig if he tried that hard. I told him to get his stuff. Really? I told him to phone first since I would be opening the door with a loaded rifle. Jake will arrive in a short bit. He stated that he has 2 sheriff's deputies on standby to watch the scene and keep things from getting out of control. I didn't want to pay the deputies to stand around and watch Rich and Bonnie load their belongings, but Jake said it was a fine idea if Rich shown ignorance. I reacted. I understood what he meant. He was terrified. Rich would say something and I'd get on his ass and end up in jail for assault. I was upset, but not to the point where I lost control. I was already in a controlled panic mode. I utilized it in an emergency situation with a fallen patient. I knew having a sheriff's deputy president was a smart decision. The entire affair was emotional. I'm delighted you spoke to the kids earlier, Susan continued. There was no way I could tell them what was happening. I broke down and began crying while listening to you. We got the kids together and I explained what was going on. I didn't think I'd be able to give my speech without tearing down, but somehow I did it. I addressed a calm but worried nurse who informed the family that their loved one did not have long to live in this world and that they should pay him a visit and say farewell while they still had the chance. Susan stated she was astonished by how the youngsters reacted. They acted as if they expected it. I mean, you said, guys, it appears that your mom and dad are up to something. And you all know that neither Susan nor I can tolerate cheating. Neither of them batted an eye. You can't believe they've already guessed it. I'm curious how they could have guessed. I replied I only learned about it a few days ago, but they all nodded and began to work, packing Bonnie and Richard's belongings. Perhaps they are in shock. Perhaps they still need to understand how this will affect them. My phone beeped and displayed a message. I took a check at it. I got an email. I'm curious if it's from being pissed off. I said 999. Susan insisted, check it out. I informed her that I didn't know how to do it on my phone because I mainly talked and texted. She laughed and grabbed my phone. After a few presses on the icons, we could hear the audio clip that had been given to me. Do you believe Robert and Susan served us? Bonnie stated. They must have found out somehow. My gosh, what will we do now? I cannot believe this. Robert was so romantic last night. If he hadn't been so intoxicated, I believe we could have done it right there in the living room. I wasn't even aware there was a problem. And now this. Relax, said Rich. They know nothing. Not really. Someone around here has mentioned that we had lunch together or drove to work in the same car. You've heard the same dumb rumors. I have heard. Nobody knows anything. Nobody can know anything. We never touch or hold hands in public, just like any other brother or sister in the world. Perhaps less. It's simply a terrible turn of events. I'd love nothing more than to leave town with Rob and Susan as arranged. However, this is premature. The kids are still in school, and we still need to figure out the finances. The concept is to deny, deny, deny. If they are foolish enough to proceed with this divorce, we will make them pay. I have a man who will take our case, and former fraternity mate. I will give him a call. Just be careful not to admit anything. Our position will be that they are listening to false rumors. No proof means no case. However, do not say anything you don't want to hear in court. Listen to this audio file and act as if everything you say is being recorded. Susan and I were silent for a few moments. Okay, so we don't know anything and are listening to rumors. I responded I'd let them think so for now. I know you understood what Rich said. They had been planning something for a long time. He's had the place for years. It makes me want to flip them and push their plans up their asses. I am concerned about the financial condition he mentioned. We need to make sure we are safe in case they do something unlawful and we get caught. Susan nodded. I didn't have to see the tears in her eyes to know how difficult it was for her to listen to that tape. "We have to stand steady." "I understand," Susan murmured quietly. Jake commented, "My situation is better than yours. Women are generally well represented in the courts. I can't tolerate Bonnie having custody of Jason and Deirdre and being permitted to reside in your home until Deirdre turns 18. A prenuptial agreement may help with property division, but if she can live rent-free while you pay child support, that is not ideal." I felt the same thing, but instead hugged my sister as she grieved for me. I told her that we would win, even though I wasn't convinced myself. There were no winners here. The goal of divorce was to minimize losses. The children grew hushed as they heard Susan and I enter the house. Deirdre and Cindy had packed as many of Bonnie's clothes as possible into suitcases and backpacks. They were now utilizing plastic trash bags. I asked them to snap photos of the bags they were using. I didn't bother explaining that. I intend to apply the value of that luggage. Bonnie's percentage of the community's overall assets. Every little bit helps. We walked next door to see how the men were doing. They were almost finished. Rich had less clothing, and the lads were shoving them into available containers instead of folding and packing them. I smiled as I witnessed Rob Rich's eldest son pack a $2,000 suit into a suitcase like underpants. They had my back. I quickly considered whether the boys would tell me or lie to me later if I peed in that bag. I chose not to put them in that position. I immediately contacted Jake after receiving a text message from Bonnie Reed while we were on our way home. He arrived 15 minutes later, joined by 2 sheriff's deputies. Jake smirked and instructed me to relax and enjoy. When I questioned if he bribed those officers to stand, Bonnie and Rich pulled up in his car, followed by another familiar figure. But Landry, talk about a coup-like attitude. We'd known Boudreaux, the bully, since elementary school. He was also dumb as a rock. Everyone who knew him throughout his childhood wondered how he had the intelligence to get through college, let alone law school, but he'd pulled it off. "Hey, Robert," he said with a smirk. He said my name, Robert, with an accent. I despised hearing it from his mouth because my father spoke it the same way. It was a heartfelt address. "I understand you're experiencing some issues with your wife and son-in-law. It's not a huge deal. I swear, if I had a pistol at the time, I would have fired a bullet directly between that bastard's eyes without blinking." I knew better than to attempt and fight him. He was 6 feet, 3 inches tall, and weighed at least pound 300. Even if the majority of his weight was in his stomach, I couldn't fight him on my finest day. I could run and let him chase me till he collapsed from a heart attack, then kick him in the head as he dropped. But everything else was out of the question. "Hello, Boudreaux." I said hello. "How are your mother and them doing?" "Good. We have a small difficulty." He said, "Just trying to figure it out." The Cajun then vanished, as if a switch had been flipped. "You don't really think Rich is amusing your wife, do you?" I politely asked Boudreaux. His wolfish grin told me this. Rich had a small level of faith in him. He knew they were having an active affair, but he planned to protect himself with rumors. So, according to the narrative, that is exactly what is happening. I replied Jake got close enough to hear me. "I can't handle it, you know? It's not something this elderly man can bear. It's not something this elderly man can bear." I dismissed that Cajun gibberish as quickly as he did. I took a step back. "You withdrew practically all of the money out of our bank accounts. Bonnie, were you accused?" "Yes, and I have statements to provide." "How much was there originally?" said I. "When we divide the property, you will receive exactly what you are owed." She stared at me. I didn't bother informing her that her credit card would no longer operate. Allow her to find out for herself. Neither Susan nor I went with Rich and Bonnie to the house to check if there was anything they could get later. My daughter Deirdre and her cousin Cindy followed Bonnie and one of the sheriff's deputies throughout the house. I told the kids that their responsibility was to make sure Rich and Bonnie didn't do anything silly. I should have been more specific about what was humorous. I hope they figure it out for themselves if it happens. Jason and Rob followed Rich as he looked about his home. "Where is my jewelry?" Bonnie asked. I knew this was going to be a huge issue of dispute. Over the years, we have taken various holidays, including Caribbean cruises and all-inclusive trips to tropical locations. Each year, I purchase Bonnie a gorgeous piece of jewelry. We are fussy. The gemstones are high-quality tanzanite, emeralds, rubies, and diamonds. A few years ago, a routine appraisal for insurance purposes assessed their value at no less than $25,000. Needless to say, Bonnie was depressed to learn that much of her jewelry was safely put away in my safe. Boudreaux started to make his point but stopped as I picked out my cell phone to capture pictures of the ring on Bonnie's right hand and the necklace around her neck. I took photos of all the stuff for insurance. I said that I wanted to check sure those items were present, but I found out that Bonnie had sold them to her girlfriend for $10. Being able to establish that they belonged to her would prevent that from happening. They are communal property, much like my boat and pickup truck, which Bonnie threatened she would seize from me today. Bonnie, as I expected, grinned. Boudreaux, on the other hand, glanced at me with an inquisitive gaze. I pondered if the fact that I actually possessed a brain in my skull could be deemed respectful. I cautiously remained silent so as not to confirm his view or reject it. Jake, who had been watching, stepped in and stated that we were all seeking for the most accurate appraisal of the society's assets, and said that Bonnie might even be prepared to turn in the ring, a necklace she was wearing, so we could complete a new appraisal at one time. After all, he pointed out that the ring and necklace existed, as proven by my photo. So why not get an up-to-date appraisal? After a quick consultation with Boudreaux, Bonnie carefully removed the jewelry and handed it to me. So, where am I supposed to go, you ask? I asked Bonnie. I was very close to asking why not to your Victoria Street love nest, but I held back. I shrugged my shoulders. I recognized how much my feelings had altered just a few days ago. I had been hopelessly in love with this woman. She and our children were my life. Now I didn't care about her at all. I was really upset at her, but at the same time I felt frigid toward her. Bonnie and Rich finally got into their automobiles and drove away. Boudreaux followed. A few minutes later I conveyed my worries, asking if they were going to take their items to the flat. Jake smiled. I hope they are. I have a man following them. Disclosing this residence at this time will enhance our talks. Unfortunately, they thought of that themselves and headed to the Holiday Inn, which was close to their office. Cheerfully, I helped them get their things inside. I was to acquire several more flash drives to hold backups of the audio and video material they provided me. Susan and the daughters were making dinner at our place when my phone beeped. Reporting another email, she accompanied me into my room to sit down at the computer. "Okay, boys," said Boudreaux. "There's undoubtedly someone following Robert. You don't want him to find out about your apartment. That's why I recommend you stay at a motel and obtain a room with 2 beds. Make sure both beds are put up as if you slept separately. The investigator can bribe the maid to check. We'll use the excuse that you're sharing a room to save money." "Yes, it drives me off when we leave even a little bit in the bank," stated Rich. "It wasn't very comfortable when my credit card was refused when I tried to check in. Good goodness I pulled the additional money out early. So what are we going to do next?" "I'm going to call the credit card company and ask if I can open a new account over the phone." "Okay, it might assist if you people wrote some notes on your assets. Robert's already thought about jewels. He probably already has a list. I'm going to discuss hypothetically for the next part. If you have money or other assets that your spouse doesn't know about, you need to protect them. Legally, they are common property. But what Robert and Susan don't know about, they can't get their hands on. I would require a list of these pieces of jewelry. But Robert stated you've already had them evaluated, so the documentation is already there. He was right when he stated you'd sell it for a few bucks and then deny its existence. If you have a bundle of Krugerrands, I propose you bury it. If you have a hidden bank account, be sure it only has a tiny quantity of money. They're easy to find. Naming your social security number is enough to start tracking, especially if the sum is high enough to report to the IRS. Offshore accounts are not traceable. Whatever you have at the time of settlement or filing a lawsuit can be safely divided. You don't want to get caught hiding assets at that moment. You will testify that everything you offer is accurate to the best of your knowledge. Lying can lead to a perjury prosecution. Do you realize where I'm heading with this? Boudreaux said farewell. So what do we do now? Asked Bonnie. They can discover our accounts in Baton Rouge. I believed we were safe, using the office as an address. Screw that stuff, exclaimed Rich. I'll be damned if Susan gets any more of my money. We need to phone the airline and check if we can fly to the Cayman Islands today. We'll open an account there in the morning. Then, we'll transmit the money online. It's too late to go to the bank to get cashier's checks. I'll check the flights. You make the place look like we slept here. You make both beds, then you wet the tissues and ruffle the towels. You wet the shower. Remember to open the soap dishes and pour out some shampoo. Please do whatever you can think of to make it look like we spent the night here. And then we're leaving. I'll phone the office and tell them we have tomorrow off." The audio file ended. "Do they have secret bank accounts?" Sighed Susan. "But how? Where did the money come from? I see the bank statements, and I know how much we make." He couldn't have buried a lot of money without my knowledge, certainly not enough to hide it in the Cayman Islands. I felt horrible about it, too. Bonnie and I were getting $50 a week in cash, so we'd have money to travel. Most transactions were done with a credit card, and we both looked at the credit card statement every month to be sure no one had made any fraudulent purchases or had the number stolen. I told the woman in the apartment that Rich was accused of distributing drugs and maintaining whores. I was pretending. But you don't really think he's truly doing something like that on the side, do you? Rich. Mr. Straightforward. Susan snorted derisively. He wouldn't know where to start, but I'd never think he was cheating on me in a little nook either. We agreed to leave the problem until tonight. There was little we could do about the concealed bank accounts anyway. We joined the kids for dinner. The following day, I traveled to Jake's legal office. I had already arranged for a jewelry appraisal. I always kept a list of all my weaponry. It took a local dealer a few minutes to determine the combined worth. I asked him for a fair price. He could offer. There is no way I would have sold those firearms for the money he quoted. But at least I had his estimate on paper. It just cost me the purchase of a new Glock pistol, which I wanted to buy anyhow. Now Bonnie couldn't say no to me. Susan went to work to get a couple of things done before the weekend. We met in Jake's office. I played the audio files from yesterday with him. I'd really like to know who's sending you these. He said that it was beyond me to conceive how they could have bugged Bonnie and Rich in a hotel room. A private investigator couldn't have done it that quickly. As for the bank accounts, we can find out their balances, but that would take a judge's order. We can't get one, not based on this record. Besides, we'd have to find the account. That could mean hiring an investigator. I'll talk to the man who performs bank investigations for us. Maybe he can locate something. But are you both sure you haven't had a lot of money go missing? We shook our heads. There's no purpose in investing so much effort into a small quantity. If they were saving little amounts at a time, they must have been doing it for years. And I'm the one who started this divorce. If you want to act as swiftly as possible, like you said Jake, Susan and I decided that we wanted to get Jake's choice over. In this state, divorce takes 6 months. But that doesn't imply you have to wait that long for a court date. Next week, we'll meet with Bonnie Rich and their jerk lawyer to go over the list of assets. Then, we'll go before a judge to make a ruling. This state has Napoleonic laws. Probate regulations are complicated, but divorce is easy, especially in cases of proved adultery. I'll add that counseling is not going to do any good on your behalf. Judges used to schedule such counseling and still do in some states. Once the judge makes a ruling, you wait 6 months, and that's the end of it. Boudreaux Landry called me this morning and asked that you release part of the money you removed from your accounts, an extra 30%. I informed him we have a prenup that specifies the duped party only gets 20% of the assets. I sent him a copy. Of course, he needed proof of infidelity. I warned him it will be presented in court. He wasn't happy about it, but there was nothing he could do about it. It's actually sort of entertaining to see Boudreaux flail. He's a pimple on the legal world's ass. I may have to find out how to get an audio cassette into the courtroom of him telling me to stash money abroad. He might not get disbarred or even sanctioned, but it would undoubtedly disgrace him. I loathed the entire concept of being away from home, but I had to go to work on Saturday and Sunday. The head nurse claims she couldn't fill in for me on those shifts. What if I start coughing and have to get tested for COVID? I asked. Can you fill in for me then? Asshole said, Sharon, and I mean that affectionately. Yes, I could fill in for you. I might have to be the only one who does, though, for this weekend. We require senior workers, and I have some business with relatives in Lafayette. They're not too thrilled that I missed the last time they all got together. My husband has already said some awful things to me for not leaving him this year. But I see where you're going with this. If I found out my husband was circling the drain, I'd turn into a mad person. You've got a lot of vacation and sick days saved up, and shit like this certainly qualifies for an emergency trip. Mental health is suited for a sick day, and then we'll start vacation. I can't believe Bonnie would do this to you. Hey, tell you what I said. There's nothing I can do anyway but stay home and drink beer this weekend and talk to the kids and my sister. How about I work this weekend and you start my vacation on Monday? Wow, really? Thank you. You saved my life. I owe you one, said Sharon. I can do that. I'll put you on vacation with no days off. I'll start with sick leave and then go on to vacation. You'll take as much as you need. Keep me posted. The task was a nice relief. Weekends were always a little rowdy. Procedures were kept to a minimum, but we still had to be watchful in the ICU, maybe even more so than during the week. We were the eyes and ears of the doctors who, except for rounds, stayed home. My father-in-law was waiting for me at the nurse's station when I returned after my mid-morning rounds, which surprised me little. "Hello, Dr. Prison. What drew a plastic surgeon into the ICU this morning?" I greeted him on behalf of the other nurses. Most people knew he was my father-in-law, and I was confident the others would be informed soon. None of the workers were aware of my family issues. Nonetheless, John, as he insisted I call him privately, was not pleased. "Let's cut the crap and talk," he hissed as soon as we closed the door to the head nurse's office, saying, "What's this nonsense about you kicking Bonnie out of your house?" I heard about it last night. She contacted her mother yesterday night, sobbing. "John, I discovered Bonnie is having an affair. I was not going to sugarcoat my relationship with this man. It took years after I married his daughter before he respected and trusted me. He knew I was honest and straightforward as day. The most frustrating aspect is that she is cheating on me with my sister's husband. I'm dealing with an entire family crisis. She claimed that the gossipers in the office started the rumor. John mentioned that they commute to and from work together and frequently eat lunch together. She denied having an affair with her boss. I wasn't going to reveal the extent of my knowledge, but it had taken me years of dealing with this man to earn his respect. So I opened up to him. I didn't tell anyone except my lawyer and, of course, my sister. "I haven't even told Bonnie and Rich everything I know, let alone the kids," I confessed, feeling emotions rise within me. I suppressed my anger and sadness. I have proof. I'm referring to video and audio files which are used to create movies. I'd never go crazy over a rumor, but this. I shake my head. Dr. John Prejean looked at me stunned. He could tell I was speaking the truth. "What are you planning to do?" he asked softly. He knew the answer before he even asked it. "What can I do?" I replied. "I soften the blow for the kids. They do not deserve to have their family torn apart, but I can't just sit on my ass and tolerate it." "John, what would you do if Bonnie came here and told you she had proof that I was cheating on her?" "I have to give it to him. John was honest with me. I'd like your head on a platter. I would help her bury you." I saw tears in his eyes. "How about Jason and Deirdre? How do they handle it? We've had several conversations. They have cousins who are in the same boat. They will need your assistance later, but they are not ready to discuss it with you right now." I explained, adding that Susan and I had yet to inform our parents about this. It's too new, too soon. We are doing everything we can to protect the children. They're acting strangely, but they're not as upset as you might think. They're taking everything in stride. The 5 kids are wrapped around each other. They talk to each other more frequently than they do to Susan or me. I have yet to discover how they interacted with Bonnie. They are currently very angry with Bonnie, as you might expect, but this will pass. I told them to talk to their mother, but I don't know if they did. I am not getting involved in this. I apologize, Robert. I had no idea. I came here today thinking you were being unreasonable. You're overreacting to gossip. John offered softly. "I hope you understand that my first priority will be to protect Jason and Deirdre." I nodded. "Then I'll have to help Bonnie, if only to meet her physical requirements. I want you to understand that I am not excusing her behavior. If you claim to have irrefutable proof, I will accept it. I'd like you to stay in touch. You are an honorable man." He turned and walked out of the office. His shoulders slumped. I felt more sorry for him than Bonnie. "Wow," Susan exclaimed when I arrived home that night. "So he discovered that his girl is not so virtuous. I bet he's stunned. You know, we'll have to tell Mom and Dad about everything soon. I am thinking about tomorrow night, when you finish your shift. I don't want them to be upset at us for keeping them in the dark." I agreed. The meeting could have been more pleasant. My father inquired whether I had proof. I assured him that I had indisputable evidence. Like John, he was more concerned about how it would affect the children than Susan, and I thought I could live with that. In our culture, children come first. Adults were taught to accept the consequences of their decisions. Children were protected while also being informed to learn. My mysterious benefactor provided no additional information, which I was fine with. I had 4 videotapes of explicit acts featuring Bonnie and Rich's faces, as well as audio recordings proving that this was not a brief affair. It was carefully planned and executed, and it had been going on for at least a few years. I didn't need any additional proof. Bonnie had not only cheated on me, but also defrauded the family financially. How she had saved enough money to fly to the Cayman Islands was a mystery. But the mere thought of it infuriated me. To me, she was not only a thief, but also a fraud who stole what should have been family wealth. Jake started investigating, using their social security numbers to locate the accounts. He assured us that even if the money was missing, we could subpoena statements showing the amounts transferred. Several of our questions were answered. The following Wednesday morning, we met to lay out all of our assets. All paperwork was to be reviewed by a financial arbitrator appointed by the court. I calculated my annual salary and located Bonnie's pay stub, which I gave to Jake. Bonnie earned $5,000 per month, and my salary varied depending on how much overtime I worked. But by the end of the year, we were earning within a few $1,000s of one another. Jake stated that even without the prenup and my proof of infidelity, that would allow for a nearly complete waiver of alimony. On Monday, the auditor requested income tax returns for the last few years. I was pleased to discover sealed envelopes in the bottom drawer of our desk. Susan had to visit the accountant to obtain copies of her documents and pay Jake to mail them. She had no idea where Rich had hidden the copies and was disappointed that they were not filed alongside other family documents, such as last year's tax returns. She was aware that his income was approximately $80,000, while hers was only $50,000. She was relieved when Jake told her she'd probably receive a sizable monthly maintenance payment. That is what we call alimony in our state. Boudreaux entered the conference room trailed by a sullen, rich Bonnie. Bonnie glared at me. Her outburst surprised me. I had expected her to apologize, at least partially. After all, she was the one who cheated and ended our marriage. I knew how she clenched her jaw. She seemed ready to curse me, but she remained silent. I figured Boudreaux had told her to remain calm. Rich was visibly upset and struggled to maintain a neutral expression on his face. The court officer introduced himself and his assistant, who took written notes and maintained an electronic record. I assumed that everything we said would be recorded in writing. Let's get started. Your attorneys have prepared forms for each of you to sign. These are simply written confirmations that any statements made here today are true to the best of your knowledge. Any statements you make may be admitted as evidence. Our goal is to create a comprehensive list of all assets and income. The judge will review the list and decide how the assets should be divided. We will not discuss prenuptial agreements, as I understand that is an issue in this case due to the car's valuation. We'll use the standard blue book for year, model, and make. I understand that your children are of driving age, even if the vehicle they drive is registered in your name. We will consider it yours if both parties agree. It will then be separated from the community property. We will get to the money later. We'll start with you, Mr. and Mrs. Fontana. Surprisingly, enumerating automobiles, firearms, boats, and household goods took only a few minutes. Bonnie's jewelry was fine. I had them appraised, and their value exceeded that of my pickup truck and firearms combined. Boudreaux insisted that the solar system be treated as a separate entity and prepared a document outlining its value and allowable depreciation. Jake looked it over, made a few notes, and nodded. The 401k accounts were listed. I questioned why, as I believed they should be excluded. No, they are counted because you've been married for more than 10 years. However, in your case, the values of both accounts are close to the same. So it shouldn't be a big deal, Jake responded. We then moved on to the money itself. Jake entered the checking and savings account statements I received after withdrawing 80% of the funds. He then conducted the same review for Susan and Rich. Mr. Jacobs, the auditor, stated that everything is relatively straightforward. What bothers me are your income statements. There should be a greater disparity between Mrs. Fontana's salary estimate and the income reported on your tax returns over the last 2 years. Rich sat up straight, holding his breath. I estimate that each of you makes $60,000. I nodded and explained that I used payroll to multiply her salary by 12. Yes, but Mrs. Fontana's income had increased significantly over the last 2 years. She reported an annual income of $140,000. My incredulous expression must have amused him, but Mr. Jacobs' assistant frowned when I exclaimed, "What the hell? Didn't you review your tax return when you filed?" he asked me. I shook my head, explaining that Bonnie and Rich had insisted on having a new accountant do our taxes for the past few years. They wanted to do a small business for one of their customers. Everything was filed electronically. "I just looked at the small return we received and didn't think about it anymore," I replied. Bonnie turned purple. "Her salary is what you counted as gross income, but she also received $80,000 in bonuses each year. According to my calculations, her net income is $60,000 per year." Mr. Jacobs spoke. I looked at Boudreaux. Bonnie and Rich Boudreaux seemed perplexed, and the other two appeared to want to leave the room. Mr. Jenkins received bonuses totaling $110,000 for each of those years. Mrs. Jenkins still needs to receive a copy of their returns, but I reviewed the certified copies provided by your accountant. Susan inquired as to the amount of the additional charge, not about $80,000 a year, but around $160,000. "So where is the money, Bonnie?" I demanded vehemently. "I suppose that explains why you two went to the Cayman Islands last Friday. You were attempting to hide the money." "What exactly are you talking about?" she started, then blurted out angrily. "How did you learn about it? Are you following me?" she demanded, then pulled herself together again. "No, I did not need to follow you. I mentioned you did it yourself." I explained for the benefit of the two attorneys, particularly the court reporter. She and Susan insisted that all of the kids install phone locator apps when they received cell phones. We used it as an electronic leash to ensure that we always knew where they were. It works equally well in reverse. I convinced Jason and Deirdre to speak with you last Friday. When you do not respond, they use the app. You were mostly offline throughout the day. They kept checking. The other kids began searching for Rich. They were taken aback when you both reappeared near the coast during the middle of the day. We assumed you were in the Cayman Islands based on the time and flight schedules arriving in New Orleans. Bonnie and Rich exchanged surprised looks. They stopped by your office on Monday and discovered you were away. They noticed you were in Baton Rouge, and I'm guessing you were transferring all of your money to accounts you had opened there. Jake pulled himself together. "Boudreaux, you and I both know that we can get statements to prove the balances in those accounts. In addition, it is illegal for an attorney to advise his clients to hide money in an offshore account in order to avoid distributing joint assets. The funny thing is that your clients flew there only hours after hiring you to represent them. It would be helpful if you informed your clients that hiding assets is a criminal offense. With those numbers, it's a felony." Bonnie started to cry. Even Rich began to appear terrified. I nearly laughed at the expression on Boudreaux's face. His face turned pale, then red as a beet. I wondered if the fat man would have a stroke. "I didn't do anything like that," he said, looking at the recorder and Mr. Jacobson's assistant, who was busy typing away. Susan looked at Jake. "Can we get them to return the money?" He nodded and said we'd get our fair share when everything was said and done, even if it meant seizing Rich and Bonnie's paychecks. "When you and Robert prove your infidelity in court, you will gain control of 80% of those accounts. They'll be held accountable for the entire amount, but there's no money in there," Bonnie exclaimed. "They vanished when we attempted to transfer it." Rich attempted to silence her, but she waved him off and continued. "I believe you are aware that you stole them," she accused me loudly, sputtering saliva. I looked at her as if she'd grown another head. "I only recently found out about the money. I suspected there was money due to your actions, but I had no idea how much. What will you claim next? Did you spend or lose it all? I believe both of those claims to be complete nonsense." She shook her head emphatically, explaining that they attempted to transfer the money electronically while at a bank in Grand Cayman. The transfer was denied, so they traveled to Baton Rouge on Monday to figure out why. Both claimed that the entire amount had been transferred electronically the week before. They requested an investigation because their online statement only showed the transfer, not the routing number or account where the money ended up. "Please provide me with the bank information for the Baton Rouge account, and I will investigate." Mr. Jacobs spoke. "I can get the results more quickly than you can. It will be recorded in the court documents as they leave the room." Rich and Bonnie appeared dejected. Susan wondered where the money had gone. I went from hearing that there was a lot of money in the account to hearing that it had disappeared. I shrugged. I was thinking the exact same thing. Another mystery. Jake and Boudreaux had expedited our case. I suspected Bonnie and Rich had begged Boudreaux to do everything he could to get us in front of a judge as soon as possible. They spent a week at the Holiday Inn before leaving and moving to an apartment on Victoria Street. It amused me to imagine them discussing opening up their love nest. They were having some cash flow problems. I knew the few $1,000s they had on hand would only go so far, especially if Boudreaux insisted on a high fee for his services. I almost wished for the audio file to be sent to me, but I hadn't received it for quite some time. The 5 children insisted on attending the hearing. I let them do so because they were affected by the divorce. They deserved to be there. Jake explained what to expect. Judge Guidry prefers to conduct semi-formal hearings. He sat at the table next to us instead of his usual elevated one. Jake, Susan, and I sat at the table on Boudreaux's left. Wealthy and Bonnie sat across from us, creating a triangle. The gallery where the children sat represented the top of the rhombus. Following Jake's lead, we stood up as the judge entered. He waved for us to take our seats. "I prefer to handle these family cases in a semi-formal setting," he said. "That means you will sit and speak when I address you. If you want to speak up, simply raise your hand, just like in school. These events are usually emotionally charged, but I expect everyone to act appropriately and respectfully. You piss me off and I'll kick you out. Understood?" I expected at least one of the kids to burst out laughing at that final statement, but they all held back. I've reviewed both cases. Normally, we treat these cases separately. However, from what I understand, the evidence and parties involved are identical. A sibling has been accused of adultery in the state of Louisiana. Adultery is not sufficient grounds for divorce. However, prenuptial agreements can have a significant impact on how community property is distributed in the event of adultery. As a result, I will eventually request irrefutable proof of adultery. First, there were some inconsistencies with monetary assets. Apparently, there were allegations that the funds were being hidden. I've received the findings of an investigation into this. Mrs. Fontana and Mr. Jenkins do have bank accounts in Baton Rouge, with balances of $120,000 and $160,000, respectively. My heart jumped. Proof that the bitch had hidden a large amount of money. As a result, the entire balance of those accounts was transferred on Monday, the day before the divorce petition was filed. According to bank records, the proper passwords were used, and the confirmation questions were correctly answered. This suggests that Mrs. Fontana and Mr. Jenkins either made the transfer themselves or disclosed the information to a third party. Despite their statements, there was no evidence that the transfer was made fraudulently. Further investigation revealed the recipient accounts and their names. This is the part that baffles me. All of the money, all $280,000, was divided evenly among 5 accounts. These accounts belong to their children, Jason and Deirdre Paterno, as well as Robert, Dave, and Cynthia Jenkins. The transfers are completely legal under the Uniform Gifts to Minors Act. These were established several years ago. I believe they were intended to fund college or provide income in the event of a parent's death. I was amazed. Why was Bonnie making such a big deal if she had given her secret money to her children? I looked at the judge again. He smiled slightly. Rich and Bonnie appeared stunned. Judge Guidry proceeded after reviewing all of the available documents. I see that the parent couple felt responsible, if not remorseful, and gave money. They hid from their spouses and their children. These deposits are non-refundable unless fraud is proven. Does anyone have evidence of fraud? I was ecstatic. Sure, I would have liked to get 80%. Still, the fact that Bonnie and Rich received nothing and the money was divided among the children made me ecstatic. I noticed Rich and Bonnie looking at Susan and me. They only knew we had outsmarted them and stolen their money. I was aware that neither Susan nor I had done anything like that. When Judge Guidry looked at each of us individually, we all shook our heads and said, "No, Your Honor." They were probably terrified of the possibility of being charged with withholding the money and attempting to hide it overseas. Aside from the looks, none of them appeared to want to counter Judge Guidry's remarks. The next matter to consider is establishing custody of the minor children. The judge stated that my daughter Deirdre raised her hand at that moment. He turned to face her. Yes, Your Honor. I looked up custody arrangements online and discovered that children aged 15 and up can choose which parent to live with. She said yes. In some states, dependents can make their own decisions if there is no evidence of abuse. However, this is not the case. Judge Guidry stated that in his cases, he makes it a point to speak with the children privately and consider their opinions. Deirdre, still on her feet, said, I don't need to speak with you in private. My mother cheated on my father, and by extension on the rest of our family. I want to live with my father. She touched Jason's shoulder. He immediately stood up and expressed his desire to live with me. Robert, Dave, and Cindy stood in line and expressed their desire to live with their mother for the same reason. My heart raced beneath the table. I squeezed Susan's hand. With a half-smile, Judge Guidry stated, I will consider your wishes. However, it has not yet been established that there was treason, as you stated. Deirdre raised her hand again. The judge looked at her again. I've also read that a 16-year-old can petition the court for emancipation. This means they can live independently, and 17-year-olds can leave home without the petition. Deirdre remained standing when the judge addressed her. Yes, it is an old law that applies to 17-year-olds, but it is still in effect. It arose because young men wanted to enlist in the military without parental permission. One of the requirements for a 16-year-old to petition for emancipation is the ability to support themselves. Is this clear? Deirdre nodded and said, Well, I have a college fund that just got $56,000 added to it. I don't consider what my parents and grandparents contributed before that. Cindy stood up right then. I agree. She said that collectively we have enough money to live on our own for a long time. Her brother Dave stood up and simply smiled. I agree. We could live together and afford to rent a nice home. Jason and Rob stood up and said that if they pooled their money, the 5 of them could live comfortably on their own. I looked at the judge to see how he would react. He could barely control his laughter. If he hadn't been in court, I believe he would have laughed so hard he fell over. Let me guess. If I do not comply with your wishes, you will all petition the court for emancipation. If you're older, you can leave on your own. All 5 heads nodded. Sit down, he ordered. I will think about what you said. There is an allegation of adultery in this case. Normally, that wouldn't be an issue in a divorce. However, both parties have signed a binding prenuptial agreement that significantly affects the distribution of common property. I'm going to ask you to provide evidence that adultery occurred. Jake stood up. Your Honor, I have been given these photos of Richard Jenkins and Bonnie Fontenot doing it. Boudreau stood up and stated, I object, Your Honor. Anyone with a decent photo editing software can take a picture like that. I have a photo of myself shaking hands with the president and another of us playing golf. My son took them for me as a joke. I would like to point out that the defense counsel has not identified the source of his alleged evidence. Judge Guidry looked at Jake, then at Susan and myself. Jake nodded for me to respond. Your Honor, I am still determining the source of our evidence. I received a number of video and audio files from an anonymous source. I took these photos as screenshots of one of the videos I received. I was reluctant to provide the video and only admitted it as evidence if absolutely necessary. But I have a DVD and a thumb drive containing the entire video. I looked at Rich and Bonnie. Both of them appeared to be about to shit their pants. They shook their heads as if they didn't believe what I was saying was true. Judge Guidry looked at Bonnie and Rich to see how they responded. Their faces had turned purple and they were obviously agitated. Okay, do I need to reproduce the file that Mr. Fontenot recently provided to the court? Or do all parties agree that infidelity has occurred? I knew Boudreau would have loved to see the footage. However, when Bonnie and Rich pleaded with the judge not to show the video, White backed down. Please set aside a minute or two for my clients, Your Honor, he asked. He turned and simply looked at them as they shook their heads firmly. We agree with the plaintiff's claims, he admitted reluctantly. Judge Guidry stated, In that case, I will announce my verdict. I'll simplify it because my opinion applies to both parties in terms of common property distribution. Because all parties agree that infidelity occurred, the marriage contract will be upheld in each case, just as we hoped. Susan and I were awarded 80% of the community property. Judge Guidry suggested that we consult with our attorneys about the actual distribution of who gets what. He hinted that we wanted the court to avoid getting involved in the details concerning the custodial parents. The only acceptable outcome would be to give Robert Fontan complete custody of Jason and Deirdre Fontana. At the same time, I give Susan Jenkins custody of Cynthia Robert and David Jenkins, as both plaintiffs requested in their petition. The non-custodial parents have complete visitation rights. Legally, the divorce will be finalized in 6 months. The awards they received increased their relative incomes, and Bonnie and Rich were required to pay child support. Bonnie was to give me $1,000 per month, while Rich was to give Susan $2,000 per month for the next 3 years. Each dependent child was to receive $500 per month until they turned 18. I assumed Bonnie and Rich were screwed, but Jake informed us that the payments were actually minimal. He thought they got off easy and said we could file an appeal. I shake my head. Susan questioned my sanity but followed my lead. We left as soon as the judge announced that the hearing had ended. Jake said he'd set up a meeting with us to finalize the property distribution details. I instructed the kids to go home, change their clothes, and wait for me. I needed a family meeting. Susan and I walked to the back of the courtroom where my father was waiting. "When did you figure this out, Dad?" I asked. Susan looked at me, puzzled. It hit me when Deirdre and Cindy made their comments about the video. "That is when you figured it out," I said to a perplexed Susan. 999 is a personality created by the children who are upset. Her mouth dropped open with surprise. "No," Dad replied. "I realized what was going on a couple of days ago when I looked over an old credit card bill. Around 2 months ago, Jason and Rob approached me about using that card. They stated that they were planning something special for your upcoming anniversaries but required a credit or debit card to make an online purchase. They said they'd combine their funds and refund it to me. They said it had to be kept secret, but the total amount would be around $500. When I received the statement, I discovered that the purchase was made at an electronics company. I didn't pay attention at the time, but I called the company a few days ago to inquire about what they purchased. The electronics company turned out to be extremely secretive. At first, I only told when I noticed that the card was in my name and that the billing and shipping addresses did not match. The kids purchased phone bugs for $500. I asked. These small spy devices must have been expensive. Dad didn't know where the kids got their video cameras. Dad decided to follow me home and find out. He wanted to know the rest of the story. All 5 kids were waiting in the living room. They fell silent. Susan. Dad and I went through the front door. "Let's go to the kitchen and sit at the table." Susan paused to grab 3 bottles of beer and handed one to Dad and the other to me. Jason and Rob extended their hands, grinning. "You may be old enough to be spies, but you must also be of legal drinking age," I said. They shrugged. It was clear that I wasn't angry. "Okay, who wants to speak first? Let's start from the beginning," Deirdre began. It all began when Cindy and I visited my mother's office, but she was not present. Neither was Uncle Rich. This occurred around the time they began Phase 2 of the COVID lockdown. We could get a few dollars from one of them to go see a movie. Anyway, the receptionist said they were out of the building and had already left. We decided to find out where they were since it was well past lunchtime. You know, my mother insisted on installing a locator feature on our phones. It indicated that they were at a strange address, so we investigated. It was an apartment building. When we arrived, we saw Uncle Rich's car and waited. They appeared later and did not behave appropriately. They were walking hand in hand and smiling. That got us thinking, so we began checking to see where they had gone. They returned to the same location 3 days in a row, each staying for about an hour and a half. They used to go there late at night, usually after work. But before leaving, we told the boys about it. Rob continued. We searched the internet and discovered these small bugs that can be inserted into cell phones. Once downloaded, the app functions as a continuous phone call, but it runs in the background and does not interfere with regular calls. True, the battery drains slightly faster than usual. It transmits all sounds around the phone in case someone tries to eavesdrop. We convinced Pop to let us use his credit card to buy them. Sorry, pal. We lied a little. Getting the phones to install the bugs and app was simple. We then proceeded to check them and listen in on conversations. We recorded anything interesting to share with each other later, so the audio recordings are clear. But how did you get the video and figure out which apartment they occupied? I asked. We looked at the keys. They both held a key marked 200 and. That is not their office number. So Jason took his mother's key and copied it. We entered the apartment several times and looked around. Deirdre informed us that we needed cameras, so we bought a few, and Dave suggested we get a small transmitter. That was cool. The boy was enthusiastic about technology. He didn't notice as he described the dissolution of several marriages and the separation of two families. At the very least, Susan and I received some answers. The cameras were motion-sensitive, so they didn't consume a lot of batteries. We hid the receiver by securing it beneath the couch. The receiver received information from the cameras and sent it to them. Our receiver is here, we filmed. It appears simple. So you captured a video of Bonnie and Rich doing it. You also recorded and sent audio files to me. I spoke cautiously. These were my children, nephews and nieces. I could not give in and ruin my relationship with them. However, there was another issue. Money, Dad. When Cindy and I first looked at that apartment, I realized our mother had left, said Deirdre. They are not gone, but they have not returned to our family's previous location. They had clothes stashed away, and Mom wore a few outfits I recognized. She also carried a makeup kit, towels, and washcloths. We understood what they were doing. They'd work out, get cleaned up, and then return home to you and Aunt Sue as if nothing had occurred. We were all furious. Sue, you announced that they weren't just cheating, they cheated us. Now, about the money. I mean, the secret bank accounts were a minor issue. Cindy mentioned that when we looked around the apartment, we discovered some bank account papers. There were instructions for accessing them online. It took a while to see the actual accounts. We even spent some time in Dad and Aunt Bonnie's offices, peeking in on them occasionally. The receptionist invited us in to wait for them. She giggled. We searched through a slew of folders before discovering one with some applications in the bottom drawer of Dad's desk. Then we returned to Aunt Bonnie's office and discovered additional papers, including a small notebook in her purse. Passwords and other information were stored there. Of course, it didn't say secret bank account, but the password was unusual, much more so than the one she used for her cell phone. And it worked. It took some time, but we finally realized what it was. The correct password. It turned out that they were using the same password on both accounts. Jason assumed responsibility for the account. We already knew that we were fiddling when we discovered they had hidden bank accounts, and we were very upset. We wondered if they were selling drugs or embezzling money. Dave is the only one who came up with the idea of putting money into our accounts. Dave flushed. Actually, I said, we can't let Dad and Aunt Bonnie get rich while leaving the rest of us hanging. We read about how to divide assets in a divorce, and we didn't like the idea of them keeping half of the money. We had accounts that Pablo had set up for us, and I thought we should withdraw the entire amount. I was afraid the cops would catch us, but I decided that because we were minors, and it was our parents' money, we wouldn't get in serious trouble. The rest of us figured it might work, so we did. If we had known about the 8,020 share, we most likely would not have taken it, Deirdre said regretfully. But it actually worked out better that way. Then you guys began sending me video and audio files. I said this while looking around the table. I was at least relieved to see a display of restraint rather than outright pride. That was the most difficult part, Dad, Jason admitted quietly. We were extremely upset with Mom and Uncle Rich for what they were doing to all of us. We didn't want to hurt you or Aunt Sue, but we just couldn't do anything. So we sent you the first video. We kept an eye on you. You kept encouraging us to go see Mom and Dad. We kept trying, and we knew you were mad or upset. If you had pulled a gun from the safe, we would have told you everything. We knew you would tell Aunt Sue. We've moved on. We've already moved the money Mom hid. I believe we stole it. I know we stole it, but we assumed they had cheated us, so it was only fair. I hope you and Aunt Sue were not too upset. I looked at Susan, who had an expression of amazement on her face from the beginning. I hope you kids never get mad at me or Sue, I replied with a smile. But if you ever nail me like you did your mother and Rich, I'll beat you to death, even if I'm in a nursing home with my walkers. They all laughed at my threat. You'll never have to worry about that, Daddy, Deirdre said. You will never let the family down. The Cajuns stick together. One thing. I do not understand. My father claimed you purchased cell phone bugs with my credit card. They were expensive. Where did you get your money? In the card for the video cameras. From them? Yeah. They cost around $500 per camera because they shot full-length video with sound and had built-in motion and sound detectors. Jason responded. We got 5 of them, plus another $500 for a hidden transmitter that sent a signal to a receiver. We connected to Deirdre's computer. That's $3,500 plus shipping, but if we return it undamaged, we'll get half of that back. We have already removed all cameras and the transmitter. We probably lost the cell phone bugs, though. We used Dad's Visa credit card. I didn't have a Visa card, so I told them we did now. I applied for it and forged your signature, Jason explained. At least he was honest enough not to appear guilty. The limit is $10,000, so we mail it every day. So hiding it was simple, said Deirdre. Cindy and I set up an email account, irritating 999. Rob came up with the name. He stated that what Mom and Uncle Rich did made him angry. The child smiled and nodded. Susan, Dad, and I were very impressed. Are the bugs in the cell phone still active? I asked. Dave nodded and stated that they would work as long as the cell phone batteries were functional. Dave explained that the phone location app allows us to always know where they are and what they are doing. He was ecstatic when he realized they weren't in trouble. We can hear when one of them is talking on their cell phone. It's voice-activated, so there are lots of car sounds and just talking about business. We took turns going through the files to find anything important. I demanded access to the audio recordings. As a result, Susan and I were well aware of Bonnie and Richard's demands at the property division meeting. Bonnie was so eager to get the jewelry that she gave me the majority of the cash and all of the housewares. We agreed to some of their requests without much argument. However, we made them grovel during the procedure. Susan surprised everyone except me when she suggested they both walk across town and back with signs on their heads reading, "We cheated on our spouses." The alternative was to challenge the amount of alimony and child support. I expected Boudreaux's eyes to pop out of his head at that threat. We overheard Boudreaux tell them that they got off easy with the child support payments and warned them that Susan and I would most likely appeal the amounts. Susan eventually recanted, forcing them to apologize on their knees. Epilogue. I'm not sure how it happened, but I'll swear on a stack of Bibles that I had nothing to do with it. 2 months after our hearing, the insurance company where Bonnie and Rich worked discovered that he had rented an apartment for a love nest using company funds. Although everyone in the office has received premiums for the past 2 years, Bonnie's premiums have been significantly higher than average each year. Rich also received large bonuses. I'm still trying to figure out why. When all of this became public, he and Bonnie were fired. Not a big deal. The company did not want any publicity. None of the videos ever made it onto the internet. Susan and I could have cared less. We joked over beers that it would have been fun to make them stars, but the kids did not want to embarrass themselves in public. We understood their point of view. Bonnie and Rich now live in New Orleans and work for a small shipping company. Since leaving town, they have made few visits to the children and rarely called. Last I heard, they were having trouble paying child support and alimony. I wish them well, maybe not at the end. Thank you for watching. I hope you liked it. So, subscribe to my channel and watch the video below.